Hello, everybody. This is AJ. Two quick pieces of housekeeping before we start the show. The first is that we owe a great big thank you to Marco Arment. He is the creator of Overcast, which is the application we've been using to insert chapter titles and chapter markers in our MP3s. If you're using a podcast player that supports this feature, you may have noticed recently that you've been able to skip from chapter to chapter. That's thanks to Marco. Marco makes my podcast listening app of choice for iPhone, iOS platform. It's called Overcast, and you can check that out at overcast.fm. The other big shout out goes to Ruchit and Tom. There was an issue with recording their audio, and as a result, their audio is not going to sound quite as good as you're used to. My audio should sound fine, but you know, you get what you pay for. So thanks for listening.
I have a sincere question. Why the hell does iTunes suck so much? Like, why?
iTunes is terrible. Everybody thinks that iTunes is terrible.
Yeah. No, I'm plugging my phone to my computer, and iTunes demands access to my phone. I say I don't want it to have access to the phone, and so then it just keeps asking, like every 5 freaking seconds.
Why don't you just give it access to the phone?
Because I need battery power, and I'm upstairs, and I don't have my charger up here, so I'm like plugging it in, and so I have to do this, Tom.
I mean, it seems like your problem is you have iTunes open. I don't know why you have iTunes open.
No, I closed it. It automatically opens, even though I didn't ask it to open.
Oh, that's weird.
What's the deal with Apple? Like they have to like slow down my iPhone. They have to force me to use iTunes. Like this is just it's just like, let me do what I want. You know what I mean? I mean, but shouldn't it be easy to not use iTunes? Like, shouldn't you be able to plug in your phone without having iTunes automatically come up and bother you?
Easy for me.
It just seems like a basic right as an iPhone user. You know what I mean? I'm not saying it's like guaranteed by the Constitution, but like I'm an iPhone user. I don't want to deal with the problem that is iTunes.
I think Apple is doing you a favor by teaching you never to plug in your phone to computers.
Yeah, why'd you plug your phone in anyway?
It's my computer. Like, I'm not plugging it into the computer at the library. It's atrocious. I mean, thank goodness I'm not like trying to use iPhoto. Like, if you guys tried to use iPhoto in the last like 5 years, oh my God.
Richard, it's not called iPhoto. The reason why you may be having trouble with iPhoto is that iPhoto was deprecated right around 3 or 4 years ago, and it's just photos now, and it's a totally different app.
Yeah.
Is it any good?
Yeah, it's like terrible, but it's fine. Considering it's terrible, it's like pretty decent.
It's on the computer, right? We're talking about the Photos app on the computer, right?
Yes, Richard.
Is it any better than iPhoto? I'm afraid to open it up.
Yeah, I use it. I use it every day.
So, wait, let me get this straight. You've been using iPhoto for the last, 3 years?
Well, yeah. When I had my old computer, I used iPhoto.
Is iPhoto still on computers?
Yeah, of course it is, dude.
Oh, man, that's crazy. Like, what else? Like, what other ancient technology do you still use?
Well, I was considering getting a Motorola Razr after this latest, Did you guys ever have the Motorola Razr, by the way?
No, when I was in high school, I always wanted a Razr. I was like real jelly of the people that had Razrs.
Okay, so the Motorola Razr, for my estimation, was the best like phone, like in a cell phone, like ever. Like it was the best like phone for using as a phone. You know what I mean? It was even better than like the Nokia bricks and stuff like that. The battery life was really good. The phone quality was excellent. And they had a 1.3 megapixel camera, which wasn't terrible. You know what I mean? So what are we talking about today, guys? What's the plan?
Rich, how many Apple products have you bought in the last week?
Dude, this is very embarrassing. I wonder if this is like a safety risk for me to like disclose this number. Do you know what I mean? Like, do you think our listeners will like hear this and be like, man, I'm going to that guy's house? You know what I mean?
I mean, every episode you talk about the number of Apple products AJ has.
Yeah, I mean, but I'm always talking about how many iPads he has, and nobody needs that. You know what I mean?
So how many Apple products did you buy this week?
So, I bought an iPhone X. Are they calling it the iPhone X or the iPhone 10? What are they calling it?
Sounds like you're calling it the X.
Yeah.
No, I don't know. What's the right thing to call it?
Apple calls it the iPhone 10. I kind of think everybody's going to call it the X.
Yeah. So can I give you the argument for X over 10?
That's how it's spelled?
Yes.
Rich, let's take it from the top. What Apple products did you buy this week?
So I've got an iPhone X, okay, which I've upgraded to. Sprint has a fantastic upgrade plan. Then Steph has a new iPhone X. Then what else? Oh, I have an Apple Watch, but then I was able to get a better deal on the Apple Watch, so I bought another Apple Watch, and I'll be returning for an Apple Watch. To be fair, that's it. Those are the products.
You got the Series 3?
I did get the Watch Series 3. Yes.
Did you get it with cellular?
I did. Yeah.
Oh,
did
you activate the cellular?
I have activated the cellular. Yeah.
Have you made any phone calls?
What'd you say?
Have you made any phone calls?
No, but I've sent a lot of text messages. I have to say that Siri has never worked as good as it does on the Apple Watch Series 3, because I'm loving sending people text messages, like basically like voice messages that get transcribed as text messages. Yeah, it's really nice and easy.
Yeah, so Lily and I are like day one Apple Watch adopters in like 2015, and it genuinely is the best Siri device. Like, I'm sort of hopeful for like when the HomePod comes out that it is a good Siri device, but like my number one device for using Siri is my Apple Watch.
I hate Siri.
That's because you don't have an Apple Watch.
Yeah, I do on everything else, Tom. I'm with you. Yeah, I'm totally with you on that, by the way. I think Siri's like completely worthless. Except
you were
on
just
the
saying
Apple
how much you love it.
on the Apple Watch, but it's worthless on the iPhone. I mean, now we'll see if the iPhone 10 is any better, but in the other iPhones, I would say,
Man, Ruch, with all these Apple products, you're like an Apple Uber fan.
All right, number one takeaway from iPhone 10. Go.
I don't have one. I haven't set it up yet.
Ruch hasn't used it yet.
How long have you had it?
A few days.
2 days. Have you used it?
No, I haven't used it yet.
Have you taken it out of the box?
No. Well, actually, that's not true. I took it out of the box 30 minutes ago.
What has prevented you from setting it up?
Well, I wanted to have a case because I recently cracked my iPhone, like my older iPhone. And so I don't want to use the new iPhone without a case. And the case, I bought a case off Amazon that turned out to be like really crappy. And then I asked my brother what case I should buy. And that case just arrived today.
What case?
It's like the Max Boost iPhone X case. I don't know. It's just whatever you told me to buy.
This is so wasted on you.
What?
Oh my God! Of the three of us, the person who like would least get like the most out of an iPhone 10 is you.
Why?
Ruch, the best case for iPhones are the Apple cases.
Yeah, but dude, I'm not gonna pay like $50 for a case. Like, are you serious? Like,
they're only like $35.
Well, I guess it just depends on how much you want to protect that Apple phone of yours.
I mean, I've had other cases before, and they've been great. Like, the only reason that I have currently a cracked screen on my older iPhone is because I was going around without a case. So,
I mean, that's
I can't believe you had a phone for 2 days and you haven't set it up.
I mean, I think it's just what it is, dude. I mean, what can I say?
I got a new iMac.
So, okay, so I guess it's important for our users to know that AJ is maybe the richest person in Austin, given his 14 iPads, 7 watches. AJ actually wears 3 watches per hand, and the other one he wears on his foot, which is sort of strange, but hey, if you can get it on your foot, why not? So you've got that, and then of course 4 MacBooks. AJ's ownership of Apple products is similar to when you go to Taco Bell and they offer you that box of like 10 tacos for $7 or whatever. Like, that's
no
AJ's
one knows
approach.
about that, dude. That's
AJ's approach, but to Apple products. You know what I mean? So but to be fair to AJ, this is his first iMac, or the only iMac rather in the household. Isn't that correct, AJ?
Yeah, this is my first iMac.
So this is the first. Well, okay, let me not say it's the first $5,000 computer AJ has owned, but it's the first $5,000 iMac AJ has owned.
I got it from the refurb store. and it's good. It's huge. It's like way bigger than I expected. Have you ever heard about how big these things are?
This is the 27-inch iMac, right?
Oh yeah.
I saw that picture that we had going around on the Slack, which I think, Tom, you should put in the show notes, was pretty hilarious. Of a person carrying their iMac in like this fancy hipster case.
That seems pretty reasonable to me, actually. Like if you need to get your iMac from one place to another place, like having like a shoulder bag for your iMac seems totally reasonable.
Why are people getting shoulder bags? Why are people taking their iMac from like point A to point B? It just doesn't make any sense.
All right, so which of us is suing Apple?
So I actually read the 2 lawsuits. Have you guys looked at the lawsuits?
Yeah. I read the complaints.
Yeah, I read the 2 complaints. So I think the California complaint. So there are 2 complaints, right? So these are both going to be class action lawsuits, and maybe it's worth spending like 5 seconds on like what a class action lawsuit is for our listeners.
Okay, so let's start at the top. Tom, why is Apple getting sued?
So how far back should we go?
So like in 1984, Steve Jobs invented the Macintosh.
Yeah. Well, so I think
further back.
No, I think it's
Steve
important.
Jobs was the son of an immigrant. I think that's an important thing of a Middle Eastern immigrant,
Syrian immigrant.
I
think the important thing is to remember, or to the context that we need is that battery technology hasn't evolved that much in comparison to the power consumption of processors. And when the iPhone was first introduced, or when really these smartphones were first introduced in the late 2000s, the processor power consumption was not that taxing on the batteries that were in these phones. But as these iPhones and other and other smartphones have gotten better and better processors, and to date, like the processors in your iPhone really rival a lot of the laptop computers that many people use on a day-to-day basis, it taxes the battery to a great amount, to where when the battery drains down, the battery at certain ages, the battery is unable to supply a sufficient amount of current to the processor to allow the processor to function normally. And when that happens, it basically causes basically the phone to reboot or to restart out of just a colossal system error. Right. So in order to address this problem, what Apple did without telling anyone was, when it noticed that its phones were approaching that threshold where it was getting to the point where it could crash, it would throttle the processor so that the processor would not consume as much wattage from those batteries as to cause it to reboot. Right. And so what happened was, some Reddit user discovered that, his old iPhone with an old battery was going really slow, and he did a Geekbench test, and then he replaced his battery, and then
how old was his phone?
It's like 2 years.
So like what generation?
I mean, so they're saying that it's mostly affecting. Apple says it affects iPhone 6 and 6S and 7. So that's generations starting, like if iPhone 10 is the current generation, then it goes 3 generations back from there.
Yeah. Well, hold on. iPhone 8 is the current generation, right? So like it actually only goes back one
iPhone 8
generation.
and iPhone 10 are the same generation. So it's 3 years prior to that.
All right, let me finish my explanation. All right, you asked how old these phones were. The bug applies to iPhone 6s right now. In about a year, the bug will apply to iPhone 7s. Okay? So in both cases, they put this patch in that when that threshold, when the iPhone, the battery approaches that threshold, it throttles the phone, right? Apple didn't tell anyone. This Reddit user on his iPhone 6 discovered this problem, and then it was later confirmed by Geekbench, who does basically testing of of processors. And then Apple made a statement to TechCrunch basically confirming that this is what they were doing and then giving the reason why they did it. So Apple is being sued as a class action vehicle for the throttling of their battery.
And so maybe this is a good
throttling
time
of
to
their
talk
CPU, rather. Sorry.
Throttling, and to be fair, I would say throttling of the user's CPU, right? This is something that the people that bought these phones are experiencing. But Tom, maybe we should spend 5 seconds talking about what a class action lawsuit is, why they exist, why do people file class action lawsuits?
I mean, class actions really don't exist if we're being honest.
Tom, one of the rules original of improv is to go with the question.
Yeah. Well, I'm fighting the hypothetical here. No, okay. So class actions were a vehicle intended to solve a real serious societal problem, and that is what happens when you have a giant corporation or a giant, an individual with a lot of power that basically issues a death by 1,000 cuts, right? Like takes $1 here from every customer that they own. They may have 20 million customers, and each individual customer isn't going to sue that corporation over that lost dollar, right? But that corporation just made $20 million by stealing money from each of their customers at a cent at a time. If you guys ever watch Superman and or Office Space, it's the plot of these movies, right? Where they have a hack that, every time there's a monetary transaction that is, less than a cent, they would either round up or round down and transfer the remainder to a separate account and steal that money. Well, over time, these tiny little infractions add up to a lot of money, and there's no way for society to gain recourse against these corporations for that type of activity that causes only a very small injury that no individual person would go after the corporation or person for, but over the aggregate is a very real and significant problem in society, and something that we want to discourage individuals from doing. And so the law invented what is known as the class action vehicle, where a person says, I'm going to represent, I had this bad thing happen to me by this defendant, and I'm going to represent everyone who is sort of like me in my class of people who have also had this bad thing happen to them, caused by this defendant, and I'm going to sue the defendant on behalf of all of these people. And then if I win, I'm going to divide the proceeds among all the members of the class, the individuals who also had this wrong thing happen to them. And so it was a great vehicle, not necessarily for huge monetary recovery, right, for any individual class member. That isn't the purpose of the vehicle. The purpose of this lawsuit isn't to try to enrich any individual person who had a wrongdoing occur to them, because it's a very small wrongdoing, right? The purpose was to make sure, A, that this defendant stopped doing the bad thing, and B, to try to recover, on the aggregate, whatever ill-gotten gains that they got.
Yeah. So Apple's being sued as a class action, and kind of building on what Tom said, right? Let's say that Apple is actually liable here, for example, and say that Apple has been purposely slowing down people's phones without their consent, without notifying them that they would be doing so, and the wrong that's occurred to these people is probably relatively small, right? Maybe it's $50 worth of harm, $100 worth of harm. No one's filing a lawsuit to recover $100. But if Apple has been able to get additional sales, which is people are upgrading their phones when they otherwise wouldn't, because Apple is now effectively damaging their phone through the use of an update, then they have suffered some sort of wrong, and they should be compensated for that. It is at least the theory. So what do you guys think of the lawsuit, I guess, or the lawsuits?
I mean, I don't think they have a chance.
Yeah, from a legal perspective, I think it's going to be rough going.
How about this? I'll go over the theories for the California lawsuit, and then you could go over the theories for the Illinois lawsuit. But I don't think both of these have a chance, right? So the two theories in California are breach of implied contract. That's count number one. So the idea here is that, you know, like you can have contracts that are explicit, right? So like I actually write down on a piece of paper, Ruchit's going to mow my lawn, and then he has to do it. Even if he doesn't sign it, as long as I write it on a piece of paper, he has to. And then, so there's an applied contract, right? Which is when you have some sort of transaction and, you know, you don't really write about it, or you don't even really talk about it, but it's sort of implied between me and Ruchit that, you know, so he'll do something, right? So if I say he's going to mow my lawn, right, then it also sort of assumes that he's going to like do a good job, right? So there's like an implied warranty that he'll like perform in a workmanlike manner, right? So the first California theory is breach of implied contract. Basically that there's sort of implied duty that Apple has not to slow down people's phones. And then the second theory is trespass to chattel, which is great. Apple trespassed on people's chattel. You know, I think the theory there is that because Apple went into your phone and changed it, and the phone is your property and not Apple's property, right? So Apple like altered your property in a way that is a trespass. I think both of these theories aren't going to work, right? Because Apple, Apple pushes out software updates, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad, and sometimes you agree with them and sometimes you disagree with them. But that's life, right? Like you wouldn't have like a trespass to chattel claim if you just happen not to like the new direction for the UI design in iOS 7. And I also think that Apple has a good story here, right? Like these batteries degrade and your phone shuts down randomly. And if they didn't slow down your processor, then your phone would shut down in the middle of you doing something important. And it's much better that it happens slowly than not at all. And I mean, I think that's like totally reasonable. So, you know, I don't think that they breached an implied contract because they have, you know, they have a story about why this was a good faith measure, and it wasn't a trespass to chattel because you don't have to download software updates. So, I mean, where are you at?
Yeah, so the Illinois case is more based on sort of deceptive trade practice, which is that Apple did not disclose. One of their theories, anyway, is that Apple did not disclose that they were releasing an update that would slow down your phone. And that they did this to deceive you, to basically force you to buy a new phone, right? And one of the things that they claim is that alternatively, you know, you could have, instead of buying a new phone, you could have bought a new battery, right? And instead you're having to buy a whole new phone. So I think this argument's actually somewhat decent, the deceptive trade practice argument, which is that Apple is doing something to your product and they are not disclosing that they are doing this, you know, and that is actually causing, you know, economic harm to people because they're having to upgrade faster than they would otherwise want to. So I don't know. I think actually like some of the issues are going to go on like certifying the class action. So commonality amongst users might be an issue. That's one of the elements of a class action. But I think the underlying claim that Apple has deceived its users by slowing down their phones is actually a pretty decent claim.
But what's the harm?
No, the harm is that it's I mean, there's two harms, I guess. The first is that it's actually interfering with your ability to sort of use the product that you purchased, right? They're actually like making your product materially worse, right? It's not like a design feature in you know, whether you like a certain emoticon or you don't, right?
I mean, isn't that true of the underlying bug? I mean, you could argue that bug was Apple's product fault, right? Like if Apple hadn't increased the processor requirements of their successive generations of iPhones, then this bug would have never occurred, and it would only be an Android problem and not an Apple problem.
So here's the context of this, right? Oh, go on.
Yeah. So here's an important kind of thing to add, right? Is if Apple had disclosed this issue, even in like the shittiest way, like maybe this would be a little bit less of a problem because then you were informed and you just chose to download the software anyway.
I mean, honestly, though, Ruch, I think you would be still making these same arguments if they were actually in the release notes.
Well, I think you guys would be making the same arguments short of, you know, Apple like admitting, yes, we slowed down your phone in order to force you to upgrade. And then maybe you'd be telling me things like, well, listen, they knew you needed to upgrade. So obviously Mother Apple was doing you a favor.
So here's the context, right? Like in late 2016, early 2017, there were iPhones that were shutting down totally at random. And it wasn't affecting a huge proportion of phones. But they were shutting down seemingly at random. And iOS 10.2.1, which came out in the winter, winter 2017, right? So like February of 2017, Apple released iOS 10.2.1. And one of the things that did is it addressed the shutdown issues. And shortly after it was released, Apple said, you know what? For phones that have this installed, we're seeing an 80% reduction in iPhone 6s and 70% reduction in iPhone 6 devices unexpectedly shutting down. The idea here is that Apple had like a real problem with the iPhone 6 and 6s models that were shutting down. And this is a reasonable solution, right? It is an effective solution that caused them to stop shutting down, right? And keep in mind that Apple warrants these devices for 1 year, and then they sell an extended warranty, and that extended warranty only extends it out by an additional year, right? And all of the phones affected by this were sort of either pretty close to the end of when Apple would warrant them, or past when Apple would warrant them. And so, once your phone is older than the manufacturer would warrant it, it's not like you have this expectation that it's supposed to work perfectly, right? Like you sort of expect, you expect that is sort of like the reasonable life of the phone when it will be covered by Apple, right? So to the extent it's defective, if it's defective outside when Apple warrants it, then you're sort of on your own. And if it's defective during the time when Apple warrants it, then you can take it to Apple and get it fixed. But Apple actually fixed these devices for people outside of the period when Apple warrants those devices. And in fixing those devices, they actually made it better. Like, I don't know about you, but it seems like having a slower phone is better than a phone that turns off in the middle of doing something, right? Like if you're in the middle of doing something important and then your phone turns off, that's sort of terrible, right? If it takes a little bit longer to do the thing that it's doing, that is a manageable problem. But if you just like can't download a certain file or run a certain application because every time you do, the phone seemingly at random shuts down, like that is not going to work, right? That is much less useful. So, and Apple also extended had a special return policy specifically for 6X devices that were affected by this problem, right? And so the idea that like Apple has like breached some sort of like has committed some sort of deceptive trade practice, I think is like totally unreasonable, right? Like you could say that having a defective phone in the first place is a problem, and maybe you're right and maybe you're wrong. But one, I don't think Apple did it knowingly. And two, to the extent that these phones are having problem, it's outside of the period when Apple warrants them, and you sort of know the length of the warranty before you buy the device. So in either case, right, like I just don't see how you could have an effective like trade practices claim.
Yeah. So I think the way you're framing it, AJ, is like very Apple friendly, right? And it's based on Apple's sort of version of the facts, right? So we don't really know. I guess we can only speculate as to any other version of the facts. But Apple's claim is essentially, well, we were doing this really great thing, because some small percentage of phones were shutting down. We released an upgrade so that 100% of phones would slow down. Isn't that right?
No.
No. So here's
100% of
here's
iPhone
my question,
6s,
right? So Apple is a publicly traded company, and if they're lying about the state of the products,
hold on, before we go,
no, let's correct it.
My correction would be it's not 100% of the phones would slow down. It's 100% of the phones that had this issue arise would slow down. So
is that actually true?
Yes.
I thought all iPhone 6s would be slowed down.
No, it's just ones that whose battery doesn't. They monitor the state of the battery, and battery that reaches like a certain threshold in terms of battery health. But isn't
virtually okay, so hold on a sec. Let's make sure we're not sort of like missing the forest for the trees. Don't you think that virtually every iPhone 6 would have a battery that qualifies for that statement that you just made, which is a battery that has reached a point?
Eventually, but everybody gets there differently, right? So like the way you charge your phone, how frequently you charge your phone, the way you use the phone, the temperature that the phone is being used at, and like there are all sorts of factors that affect the battery life of your phone. And so you could have this problem happen to you in year 4. You could have this happen to you in year 4, or you could have this happen to you in year 1, right? And so to a certain extent, it's like inevitable that this will happen to your device, but it's not like Apple has a clock where they say, all right, it's day 400, it's time to slow it down.
Well, hold on a second. You said that this should only impact devices that already have this problem, right? So first of all, what percentage of iPhone 6s, let's say 3 years in, well, I'm picking some arbitrary numbers here, and maybe you guys know the answers or maybe you don't, but what percentage of iPhone 6s 3 years in have this problem that Apple's software update is designed to fix?
Well, look at the...
I don't know.
I mean, I don't know. Apple hasn't said.
So that would be helpful to know. Like, I'm just thinking about, like, what are some things that would be helpful to know to figure out Apple's intent, right? Because, like, yeah, there is sort of this pie in the sky where Apple is a publicly traded corporation, but they're just a really good corporation. And Apple engineers would never write a piece of software that would sew down people's phones without a good reason, because they're the most noble people on earth.
So that actually isn't my argument.
No, I know, but I'm saying that's been some of the arguments that have been like floated out there, right? Is that Apple's a great company, and so they would never screw over their users like this, right? I think Apple is still subject to the same forces that every company is subject to, especially publicly traded ones, which is they want to increase sales and they want to increase profits. And so if they can get away with it, or at least they'll try to get away with it, they will do things to cause you to upgrade sooner rather than later, because that's a way to goose sales. Like, other way is to like make massive upgrades to the phone that make the phone completely different, year to year. But that doesn't really happen, right? There's a lot of like marginal improvements that occur. And people upgrade like every other year. Some people may upgrade every year, or in AJ's case, may upgrade every month. You know what I mean? Based on your charging cycle. I mean, AJ. But this is, I think, to say that Apple is not trying to get you to upgrade as quickly as possible is I think a little naive.
So, okay, 2 points on that. First point, Apple is a publicly traded company, right? And so when Apple makes like public misstatements about its products or its executive team or its financial position, right? Like, that's a problem, not just like, oh, we're going to get sued under like the Deceptive Trade Practices Act or whatever, right? Like, that's like an SEC problem. Like, SEC problems are like bigger problems, right?
Sure, but hold on. Let's not oversell those either, right? Because like the biggest problem there is they get subject to a class action lawsuit, like that's a securities lawsuit, right? Now, that only happens like when your stock price actually goes down. So if you're consistently like improving your sales and, there's no problem, like, you don't really get class action lawsuits from a securities law perspective. And then, as Tom discussed, class action lawsuits are something about it anyway.
If Apple were lying, right? Like, your position here is that Apple is lying. There's this sort of like tangential, they're deceiving because there's this sort of tangential connection between the battery situation and what they've done about it, right? And your view is that Apple is not being forthright, and the reason why they're not being forthright is that the real reason that they've been throttling phones is to cause users to upgrade.
Yeah, that's one of my arguments.
If that were true, then Apple lied, right? They didn't just deceive people, right? They said that the throttling affects a specific number of devices, and the devices that it affects are specifically connected to this battery issue. And if that turns out to be untrue, right, like that's not just a problem like in this California lawsuit, right? Like, it's a problem it's like a problem for the SEC, right? Like, it's a problem. Like, every state AG is going to go after them, and the federal government is going to go after them, right? Like, like other countries are going to go after them. The EU is going to go after them, right? Like, but you could understand, like, why would you lie just part of the way, right? Like, if you were going to lie, why wouldn't you go full out?
Because a partial lie is more defensible than a complete lie, right? Which is, they may say, listen, everything that they have said so far is reasonable. It sounds reasonable. You know what I mean? But first of all, that doesn't mean that it's the complete truth. Second, I believe that they are telling at least a partial truth, right? But they're, like all good partial truths, it's painting a misleading picture. And, it's painting this picture that the reason they're doing this is just to solve this battery problem. And as a result, it shouldn't impact most people's phones, when potentially it impacts most iPhone 6s at this point, or even 2 or 3 years in, right? if this was really such a small issue and it only impacted like 3% of phones, like 3% of iPhone 6s, don't you think Apple would have said, hey, by the way, we calculated this. This only impacts 3% of iPhone 6s. And then, bam, their PR problem in addition to this issue is over. So why didn't they say that?
I don't think they know how many are affected.
So, I mean, I think they should be able to, I think that's sort of more proof for my point that maybe it's more pernicious and they can't go out and say this does impact 70% or whatever, some large number of iPhone 6s.
What if they don't know?
I don't understand how they couldn't know, because you guys are saying that they're writing this code that's specifically only supposed to affect phones that have gone through a certain number of charges, right?
No, that's not what I said.
No, that's not true.
Then
remember, it's the wattage that is being drawn from the battery doesn't meet the requirements of the processor at the specific
moment in time.
Yeah, moment in time. Yeah.
But couldn't that be just because you're using any like sort of heavy intensive, like,
no,
like if you're getting like, there's more emojis or more screen animations.
Oh my God, Ruchit.
It can't be because of that. No, not. Oh my God, AJ. Like seriously, like this.
No. So
this slows down the battery in any like.
No.
This isn't even about Apple being like pernicious or not. This is like if you upgrade the software and the software includes like extra screen animations, right? It includes like extra processing power. Processing power impacts the battery life.
No.
So Ruch, like, this is the first problem. I think like we fundamentally disagree as to what is occurring. Like, like maybe we need to like talk about like what exactly is happening.
Ruch, I know how to explain this to you. I actually know how to explain this to you in a way you'll understand. Are you ready?
Hit me.
Okay. When you worked for Lieutenant Governor, you dealt a lot with the electric grid, right?
Totally.
So how is electrical consumption measured?
Kilowatt per hour.
Kind of. Yeah. I mean, demand is watts over time, right? Power over time, watts over time, right? So that's demand, right? So, but there's also like total consumption, right? There's total energy consumption, right? So kilowatt hours.
How many
right?
kilowatts? How many
right.
kilowatts?
So how many? So kilowatt hours, right? So let's say I have a lamp. That lamp uses 1 watt, and I run that watt for 1 hour. Then I consumed 1 watt hour, and my demand during that hour was 1 watt, right? So if I had 1,000 watts, my demand is 1 kilowatt, right?
Yeah.
And my energy consumption over an hour was 1 kilowatt hour, right? Okay. Listen. When you send a text message, it may well be that the peak level of consumption, right? The highest level of demand over the time interval is equal to the peak level of consumption. And that is the peak demand during the time interval when you were watching a video over Netflix, right? In terms of kilowatts, right? It may actually be that sending a text message is just as high in terms of peak demands as watching a 4K video. Now, obviously, sending a text message takes less than a second, and the total energy consumption, the kilowatt hours, are much fewer than a 4K video, right? But in terms of wattage, right, in terms of peak consumption, but here's the deal. When a battery degrades, right, it is unable to supply the peak level of power, right? Either the amperage goes down or the wattage goes down, but somehow the voltage that it puts out goes down. The peak level of power that it puts out goes down, right? And think about this. When you have a flashlight and the battery starts to weaken, right, the light starts to dim. Why does the light dim? Because the voltage of the battery has declined, right? Now, imagine that the phone has like a failsafe in it. It says all of these things together, the graphics, the screen, the processor, the memory, the storage, all of this together uses 5 watts. And if the battery is putting out 6 watts, that's great. If the battery is putting out 5.5 watts, that's great. But if it's putting out 4.9 watts, we have to turn it off. Like there just isn't enough power. We can't run these devices at less than 5 watts. And so the phone will just turn itself off, right? That means that at any one moment, right, if the battery is not putting out all 5 watts, then the phone shuts down, right?
If I'm doing like heavy video editing on my computer, okay, that will probably use more power than if I'm just typing up an email. Would you agree with that?
It will consume more of the battery.
Okay. One of the other, so do you think it will consume more of the battery? One of the reasons might be because there's more processing power that is needed for video editing than for writing an email. You agree with that?
Ruch, the point is that consumption of battery is irrelevant to the question of the issue before us.
Apple is defining the issue extremely narrowly.
No, the consumption of battery isn't what's causing the issue. It's not as if, you're
defining the issue differently than I am. You're defining the issue in this very narrow way that Apple has chosen to define the issue. I'm talking about this issue more broadly, which is that the battery is that because of the upgrades that Apple makes to the phone, including to like screen animations and other such things, apps running in the background, whatever you want to say, it's taking more energy from the battery as OS, as an operating system, is upgraded, rather than if the operating system hadn't been upgraded.
But that is not what's causing the phone to restart.
You're thinking of this only as to what's causing the phone to restart, as opposed to why is the phone consuming more battery power than it used to. And one reason could be for this restart issue that you're talking about, okay? The second reason could be that Apple is deliberately including a bunch of junk in upgrades that it doesn't need to include, but it's doing it knowing full well that a new phone can handle that extra junk just fine, but an older phone cannot handle that extra junk just fine.
Then it seems like we're no longer talking about the throttling issue at all.
Yeah, now you're just complaining about software updates.
Yeah.
That's a piece of the throttling issue.
No, it's not.
It's not.
I think you guys are like really just buying Apple's argument like hook, line, and sinker. So here's where the sort of cause and effect. You guys are talking about the effect, which is your iPhone shuts down randomly, without talking about potential causes for that. I'm saying that one of the causes for that effect could be that Apple is upgrading your phone in ways that cause you to use more power, more of your battery power, in order to do a function.
But that's not the cause.
Okay, actually, Rich is onto something, and it's not accurate, but that is fairly cogent.
How do you know it's not accurate? How do you know it's not accurate that Apple's doing that?
The effects would be so tangential, right? So there are so many instances that affect the health of your battery, right? So, for example, storing a lithium-ion battery when it is fully charged is worse for the battery than storing it when it's about 70 or 80% charged. Charging it more quickly is worse for it than charging it more slowly. Using it when it's very hot or when it's very cold is worse than using it when it's at room temperature, right? There's so many things that affect the life and health of your battery. The pattern of the discharge is sort of more important than the extent of the discharge. Now, it is true that lithium-ion batteries have sort of a limited number of cycles during which the battery is healthy, a cycle being defined as like using all of the charge and then filling it all the way back up and then using, right? And so, it used to be back in the old days that you would say a lithium ion battery had about 500 cycles in it before it would start to noticeably degrade, right? And so when you would buy a used laptop, people would say on Craigslist, oh, this battery only has 200 cycles. You have 300 cycles left before you get to 500. 500 was like a magic number. I think in camera terms, it's like having 10,000 shutter actuations. That's sort of like a cutoff, or 100,000 miles on your car, right? And so it is true. So Rich, it is true that that a software update that causes you to run your battery down more quickly could affect the life of your phone, right? But the relationship is so tangential, right? And then the fact is that people charge their phone every night anyway, right? So most people, when they complain about their battery running down, it's I used to be able to get home with 40% charge and now I get home with 20% charge. But the fact of the matter is that you're going to be charging your phone overnight in either instance. And so it's not clear to me that it is causing you to use more cycles, right? It could be that using your phone in your car has 10 times the effect of any single software update. So I think you're right. I mean, it is accurate, but I don't think or I think it's cogent, but I don't think it's important.
So here's my response to that. And I'll use an example here. This is sort of like the chemical companies saying, yeah, benzene could cause cancer, but it's just so tangential compared to all the other things that you do in your life. What about plastics? What about your cell phone? What about all the other pollution that's in the air? What about your lifestyle? What about inflammation? What about 5,000 other things?
You're the one positing that it meaningfully contributes, right? And my answer is that it is not clear how it meaningfully contributes. It is not clear to me, based on like what I know about physics, how it meaningfully contributes. But you're the one positing the claim, right?
No, I'm positing the claim because it's I guess it's what's not obvious to you is pretty obvious to me, which is that if you are constantly demanding more power usage from the battery and running down the battery faster, that's going to get you to that point that you're talking about quicker.
Maybe it's possible, but it's not clear to me that it's like it's not clear to me why that is a significant driver, right? I mean, you're the one positing the claim, and I just don't think you have shown the actual connection there, right? Like it just seems to me that like using your phone in the sunlight is like much worse than just having the newer software, right? Yeah. All right, Tom, what were you gonna say?
Nothing.
All right. Do you want to do a Supreme Court case?
Okay, so this is Carpenter v. United States, and the issue in this case is, does the warrantless search and seizure of cell phone records, including the location and movements of cell phone users for extended periods of time, violate the Fourth Amendment? Okay, so that's the issue, and here's the background to this case. So during the investigation of a bank robbery, the FBI requested the cell phone records of one of the alleged robbers without a warrant. They used basically a statute that allowed them to get these records from the cell phone companies without the requirements of a warrant. The records that the government got from the cell phone providers included the date and time of calls and the approximate location of where the calls began and ended on their connection to cell phone towers, the cell site information. The FBI requested this information of the defendant for 127 days. The defendant, of course, challenged this under the Fourth Amendment, and the circuit court upheld his conviction under what's known as the third-party doctrine. And the third-party doctrine is basically where, okay, let's say I'm, the defendant, AJ is the prosecution. I can't give my, I can't tell Ruchit something like, hey, Ruchit, I'm going to go kill so-and-so over there, and then expect Ruchit to remain silent about what I've told him, right? If the state wants, the state can go over to Ruchit and say to Ruchit, what did Tom tell you just a moment ago, right? And Ruchit, if he chooses, right, he doesn't have to choose.
So
if
give an example, Tom. This example might be just to make it a little bit better. Maybe is let's say you emailed me this information.
Yeah,
not that you told me. Let's just say that you emailed me.
But I think the conversation example is important because that's the most basic form. That's a witness who tells if the witness wants. The witness under the Constitution can say I'm exercising my right to remain silent. But if the witness wants, right, the witness can testify on behalf of the government and say Tom Jacobs said he was going to go kill so and so. Right? Now, the next example is the email example. Instead of telling Ruchit, I emailed Ruchit and I told him my dastardly plans, right? And it's sitting in Ruchit's inbox. The government, if it wants, could go and subpoena his ISP and tell his ISP, hey, ISP, give me all of Tom's emails to Ruchit, right? And then they'd have all this evidence against me, okay? So this is the third-party doctrine. Basically, your Fourth Amendment right doesn't extend to third parties. You can't silence third parties using your Fourth Amendment rights. Okay, and there are two relevant sort of examples of this or relevant cases that the government is relying on in this case in Carpenter to say, you know what, the cell phone companies are third parties, and the defendant's Fourth Amendment right does not extend to those third-party cell phone companies. The first case is United States v. Miller, which is a holding that a bank record seized by the government were not Fourth Amendment violations because you can't have an expectation of privacy in the information you disclose to the third party. So this is sort of the heart of the third-party doctrine.
Which bank records?
Any bank records.
Interesting. Even like bank records that were like specific to my account?
Yeah.
Dude, if you keep your money in Bitcoin, that's not a problem for you.
Well, if you keep your money in No, there's a blockchain. There's an entire blockchain.
I'm kidding, dude. I'm kidding.
Okay, so the other case is called Smith v. Maryland, in which the government used what's called
terrible
pen register to tap the phones of a defendant to learn who he was calling, and the court held that this was not a search. So basically,
can I say something about Smith real quick?
Sure.
Smith is like a case, so it's like a 1978 or 1979 case. So I think it's important to understand the government is using these cases from like this one-off case, the Smith case being a good example, to support a much bigger proposition, right? The Smith case is like in 1978, they like are keeping track of some guy's phone calls, and they're doing that without a warrant, and they're doing it where they physically are with the phone company. Okay. And they're trying to use that as an example to now say, let's do this for all cell phones. And this case was terrible. Like, I can't imagine that the judges in the Smith case thought it would be used in this way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, and you know, like, so the logical extension that the government is trying to argue is like, look, with cell phone tracking, you know, all we're doing is we're going to a third party who's like the witness, who's like Ruchit, and he's testifying about the location of the defendant, and it's not like the defendant was in any private place. It's not as if, you know, this is locations of the defendant as he was walking down the street where anyone could see him, right? Like, that's the government's argument. And of course the defense's argument is whoa, it's 127 days. That's a long period of time that you're tracking me. The defense really had, like, you know, listening to the argument, the defense really had trouble grappling with, well, how short of a time can the government capture this information for, or how long of a time would be where's the line that the court should draw? What's the rule that the court should draw? And the defense also had problems differentiating the bank records case. You know, the court basically said, you know,
by the defense, you mean the government or the defendant?
The defendant. Sorry. The defendant.
Okay. I don't know why they had so much trouble. Like, there's been a recent Supreme Court case that talks about, I mean, there's been a recent Supreme Court case, which I believe was a 9-0, which was saying that, like, if they wanted access to your cell phone, they need, I know the legal doctrine is a little bit different, but I think it's analogous. If the government wants access to your cell phone, they have to get a warrant.
Well, it was that they couldn't force you to defeat, they couldn't force you to enter your passcode. They actually, so the Supreme Court precedent is like really weird on this. They're allowed to swab your cheek. They're allowed to make you hold your thumb up to Touch ID, but they're not allowed to require you to input your passcode to a locked phone. Because
inputting your passcode would be a form of testifying, and
But that wasn't the case. I believe the case.
No, I'm talking about two different cases.
Yeah, the case that I'm talking about was a 9-0 where Roberts wrote the majority opinion, and the government actually tried to use the Smith v. Maryland case as an example of how they could get access to your cell phone, because they said it's just a phone. And Roberts made the point that no, the phone now today is not just a phone. What they were trying to make the argument that just like if you had a box of cigarettes, they could look inside that box as a search incident to arrest. That was the doctrine. It was a search incident to arrest. And Roberts said, no, like, you can't look in the phone as a search incident to arrest.
Yeah, but again, that's not a third party. Yeah, that's
no, it's not. No, I agree. Yeah. I agree. It's a different doctrine. I totally agree with you on that. But I guess what I'm saying is that I think there's a lot of analogies here in terms of how much information is contained in your cell phone and in your cell phone records. And there was a lot of discussion that Roberts had in particular, where he said that, like, just based on a person's call history today, you could figure out so many things about them. Like, technology allows you to do this, right? Just on their call records, you could tell whether they're a member of the NRA. Just based on their location, you could tell if they're a gun owner, right? How often do they go to a gun range? You could tell if they're a victim of domestic abuse based on, like, you know, whether they've been calling their psychiatrist a lot. So you can find all of these extremely deeply personal things just from a phone record today. Yeah. Which you couldn't do, which technology just didn't allow you to do during the Smith v. Maryland case.
Yeah, but let me redirect you back to the actual legal issue, right? And the legal issue is, how do you differentiate third-party within the confines of the third-party doctrine, right? Like, how do you differentiate United States v. Miller, right? And that is, I think, where the defendant had some trouble differentiating the bank records case from the instant case, because and really there is no difference other than the volume of data that is being collected and the ability, and so that that's what you have to argue, right? Is other than the volume of data that's being collected, what is the difference? And there's not much.
And maybe that is the difference that matters, as the court has found, in this very recent sort of cell phone privacy case that I was talking about, the search incident to arrest, where the volume of data made a big difference in the application of the incident to arrest doctrine. So maybe it should also make a difference in the third party records doctrine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, you want to do predictions?
Yeah.
What do you think, Ruch?
I think it's going to be 7-2. I think it's going to be a 7-2 for the defendant.
Carpenter?
For Carpenter. I believe the two dissenting judges will be Thomas and Alito. I think Gorsuch will write the majority, because I remember reading that Gorsuch's questions for the government were particularly harsh.
No, not really. I mean, it depends on what you call harsh. Gorsuch had a very peculiar view of the Fourth Amendment in terms of how to analyze this case. He was latched onto this idea that, well, aren't these your papers, right? Under the Fourth Amendment says that you have the right to be secure in a whole bunch of things, including your papers and effects, right? And in this property that you're handing. The information that you're handing over to the cell phone company, don't you have a property interest in that information? And if you do have a property interest, isn't this a seizure without a warrant? Isn't this an unreasonable seizure? That was sort of
that's pretty interesting.
How he was grappling with that issue. But again, how do you if that is how you look at this data, how do you really differentiate it from the bank records case?
Hold on a sec, guys. My alarm is going off. Sorry, guys. Babe, are you okay?
AJ, can you mute this?
No, this is hilarious. Yeah, I think the government's going to win.
You think the government's going to win? Why?
Yeah, okay. I think the government's going to win. I think it's going to be a 5-4 vote with Kennedy for the government. And the reason why is that I think that, basically, I think you have a reasonable expectation of privacy that your phone records are in the custody of AT&T on your behalf. But I don't think AT&T thinks that. And I don't think the government does.
I guess I disagree. I actually think it's going to be 9-0 for Carpenter. I think this is, it's just a step too much. It's just a lot of information that is being collected and only more information down the line. And so, if the court is going to draw a line, it's going to have to start drawing that line now, as opposed to waiting until, they have minute by minute tracking of every single movement of you to a square foot.
But subpoenaing your phone records is such an important law enforcement tactic. Not just or getting a warrant for your phone records, specifically from the phone carrier, right?
So, I think we should be clear, right? It's not taking away the right to request a warrant for these records. It's whether warrantless capture of these records is constitutional.
Oh. I had not understood that.
Oh, Ruchit said finish without him.
Is everything okay?
He said Steph was cooking and burned something.
You know what? I think you're right. I mean, I hadn't really thought about it all the way through, about the fact that it's just the warrantless search. Right. So the doctrine for warrantless searches is reasonable expectation of privacy. If you're going to breach a reasonable expectation of privacy, you need a warrant. Is there a reasonable expectation of privacy that AT&T is not going to like turn over my cell phone records? No, I don't really think so.
So you're still sticking to 5-4 United States?
I'm sticking to 5-4, but I think I'm less certain of it.
Okay. Well, you know. Sidebars?
Sidebar.
What's your sidebar?
Oh, this is really interesting. This is a good sidebar. I'm glad I wrote this down. Click on this link. It's a Politico link. It's called Drawing Trump, and this is super interesting. They took like 8 caricaturists or political cartoonists, and they asked them to draw Trump on an iPad, and they captured the screen while it was drawing, and then they got people to talk about their drawing as they were drawing it. So it's really interesting. They sort of they talk about their like methods, like how do they draw Trump, how do they make it look like Trump. One of them I remember saying, I think this was Kevin Gallagher, who said that it's sort of important that a caricature. No, this is David Horsey said it was sort of important that a caricature it's not just supposed to be the likeness of a person, but it's supposed to like reveal something to you about them. That it's sort of. It's supposed to tell you something about the person, not just show you the likeness of the person or an exaggerated likeness of the person. Anyway, these are like super interesting. So as you're listening to the audio, you like watch the caricature being drawn, and you can hear the cartoonist talking about it.
Yeah. Kind of cool.
Yeah, I recommend watching all 8 of these. Presently, I'm watching Anne Talniz.
My sidebar is the best and worst of airlines based on world timeliness. And if you're a person that enjoys traveling, you might look at this list to see which airlines are always delayed or which airlines are always on time. Surprisingly, Delta Airlines is in the top 10 best international of 2016. You have some contenders there. And then the worst airlines included like Air India, Asiana, China Eastern Airlines.
Wait,
China,
where's the link?
Korean
Did you put the
Air.
link in? I want to click on this. I want to see the good airlines. I never travel international. How often do you travel international?
I try to do it at least once a year if I can.
These are the best and worst airlines in the world from Bloomberg. Michael Bloomberg. Do you really believe Michael Bloomberg? Doesn't he own one of these airlines?
He's just
El Al is
retelling.
the worst. That's really funny to me.
Yeah.
I've flown El Al before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your experience?
It was late.
Oh, yeah. Well, there you go.
El Al is Hebrew for 2 up. The only time I travel internationally is to go to Canada. I really want to take Lily and Jonah to the UK, but I haven't gotten around to it.
Have you guys been to Banff yet?
No, I only go to Eastern Canada.
Banff, I think, is one of my favorite parts of Canada.
It's everyone's favorite part of Canada. Everybody's been there but me, and it's everyone's favorite who goes there.
Yeah, it's really good.
So I really kind of think Montreal might be the best city in Canada, but my favorite is Toronto. Like, I think objectively Montreal is probably better than Toronto, but I think like also Toronto's better.
What about Vancouver?
I like Toronto.
I really enjoyed Vancouver. Like it's a neat little place. Neat little place. Fun little.
I kind of want to move to Toronto.
Why?
'Cause it's so good.
Okay, I'm gonna link one of my favorite pictures from Banff under my sidebar. It'll be Ruchit's sidebar.
All right, I think I'm gonna go to bed.
Okay, have a good night.
I hope Ruch gets his thing figured out.